Letter 4. With all my being, I refuse to accept this amputation. A letter to Frantz Fanon. Dear Frantz, I'm neither a psychiatrist nor a psychoanalyst, but I can say with confidence that my father suffered from colonial trauma and the colonial disorder. He felt foreign to his environment, totally alienated. And even though this kind of disorder must have been very common among Algerian Jews, there was nowhere he could go to take advantage of what you describe as the quote, the medical technique that aims to enable man no longer to be a stranger to his environment. Unquote. No therapeutic or psychiatric initiative in Algeria offered Algerian Jews a way to recognize or articulate their colonial disorder. They suffered from their colonial subjection as indigenous Algerians, their transformation into French citizens in 1870, the revocation of their French citizenship under Vichy, the anti-Jewish laws in the Maghreb, and the restoration of French citizenship after World War II. The latter granted as if France had not confiscated Jewish property, deported young Jews to concentration camps in the Maghreb, and in France sent 75,000 Jews to their death, among them 3,000 Algerians living in France. The infamous Crémieux Decree granting newly colonized Algerian Jews French citizenship was not the end of their colonization, but its continuation in a different form. Without recourse to the medical techniques of which you wrote so eloquently, and with his alienation impacting all areas of his life, my father attempted to leave the toxic colonial environment of Algeria 3 times in less than a decade, in 1943, 1946, and 1949. The first time was when he was held in the Bedo internment and forced labor camp. He suspected that volunteering for the French forces and going to war would be better than staying in Algeria. Given the unresolved status of the Jews after the official end of the Vichy government in Algeria, he did not know exactly what volunteering for this army as a Jew would mean, but he went anyway. The second time he tried to leave was upon his return from service in World War II. I assume that, like many other colonized people who fought for France, including you, he quickly realized that the promise of freedom and victory over fascism was a broken one, since the racial regime under which he lived had not been defeated with the fall of the Axis powers. He then decided to move to France, but after barely a year in Paris, he returned home to Oran. Reading The North African Syndrome, 1952, which he wrote based on your observations of North Africans' experiences in France in the same years when my father left for France, helped me figure out what may have provoked his quick return to Algeria. You quote a certain Léon Munieri, who in 1952 submitted a doctoral thesis in medicine to the university in Lyon. In his thesis, Munieri denounces the French government's too hasty mistake of granting French citizenship and equal rights to Algerians working in France, quote, based on the sentimental and political reasons rather than on the fact of the social and intellectual evolution of a race having a civilization that is at times refined but still primitive in its social, family, and sanitary behavior, unquote. Even as you critique Munieri's imperial stance, you do not ask yourself, who were these Algerians that Munieri speaks of? You assume they are Arabs, and that all Arabs are Muslims. However, the majority of Algerians with French citizenship who lived in France following World War II were not Muslims. The ruling of March 7, 1944 ascribed French citizenship only to deserving Algerians, those having received the decorations, civil servants, etc. Algerian Jews had been legally considered citizens since 1870, and they migrated in small numbers to France in the first half of the 20th century. For races like Munieri, Algerians were Algerians, irrespective of their faith or citizenship status. The common racist idioms you quote, why don't they stay where they belong, are indicative of a world where Munieri could be licensed to heal people. And the trouble, as you say it, lies here, quote, they have been told they were French, they learned it in school, in the street, in the barracks. Now they are told in no uncertain terms that they are in our country, that if they don't like it, all they have to do is go back to their Kasbah, unquote. This is probably the drama my father also went through during his 1 year stay in Paris. This is the core of the Algerian Jews' disorder, and that of Algerians in general. Their self-ascribed Frenchness exceeded the status assigned to them, so much so that their performance of Frenchness was often experienced by French settlers of Algeria as an insult, and by the French in France as an invasion. In a biography she wrote about you, Ali Cherki, who, as you know, studied psychiatry in Algeria before she worked with you, shared her memory of how a French psychiatrist in training responded when he read the names of the students displayed at the entrance of the medicine school in Algiers. Ben Milou, Ben Ghazal, Ben Essa, Shiban, Aid Shalal, Boujelal, we are being invaded by Arabs, to say nothing of the Jews who consider themselves at home everywhere and anywhere they please. Unquote. Since the very beginning of Algeria's colonization, the French were obsessed with planning to expel Algeria's Jews. This, in a way, turned the Jews of Algeria into captives of the settlers' goodwill. For despite all the settler colonial violence, the French settlers offered Algeria's Jews protection from the even more vicious early plans of the other Frenchmen. For example, plans to deport them or to water, quote, the tree of freedom with the blood of the Jews, unquote. As one of the Jewish protagonists in Olivia Elkheim's semi-autobiographical novel says, quote, we are so happy to be French that from now on we have become their guests. We are no longer at home, and they're going to do whatever it takes to kick us out. Unquote. It is not a coincidence that with Algeria's independence, France's early plans came to fruition, and the Jews were forced to depart from Algeria. The French had to leave too, alas for them that they could not enjoy the realization of their dream, an Algeria free of Jews. It didn't occur to me to ask my father about his experience in France during the year 1946. What might it have meant for him to be so unwelcome, knowing that deportation could be as real a possibility for him as it was for his paternal uncle and aunt, who had been deported by the French to Auschwitz. What I regret most is not being able to awaken the anti-colonial interlocutor within him, who, in my decolonial imagination, should have existed along with his anarchic spirit. If someone like you could have helped him understand his distress, he might have acquired this consciousness, especially as his father, who died in 1943 and could not be there for him when he came back to Algeria, had been an anarcho-communist. Instead, my father had to be torn by the contradictions of colonialism, assimilation, and conversion, numb to the inherited pain of exile ingrained in those who were forced to leave their country and become converted Frenchmen. My father dissociated himself from the memory of the forced conversion to Frenchness, even though he still retained some remnants of its harm, transmitted from his parents and his parents' parents. He was not given an anti-colonial education that could have helped him account for his experience. And similar to other North African men you describe in your essay, he had a hostile attitude toward his painful past. Quote, it is as though it is an effort for him to go back to where he no longer is. The past for him is a burning past. What he hopes is that he will never suffer again, never again be face to face with that past. He does not understand that anyone should wish to impose on him, even by way of memory, the pain that is already gone. Unquote. All his life my father suffered from chronic headaches. The condition lasted until he died. It was exactly as you describe, quote, the patient is not immediately relieved, but he does not go back to the same doctor, nor to the same dispensary, unquote. No one could help him. After he tried physicians, he switched to pharmacologists and even consulted pharmaceutical companies and research centers. In one response he received from a research center in Montreal, I could see how desperate he had been to receive a supply of a hard-to-obtain drug. The third time my father tried to leave Algeria was in 1949. A Zionist advertisement in the newspaper called upon Jews to volunteer for 1 year of military service to defend the Jews in Palestine, whom the ads depicted as under an existential threat. With all the disinformation about the establishment of the State of Israel, I don't think my father could grasp the deceptive nature of this advertisement, which concealed the colonial reality in Palestine. Nor could he conceive of how the Zionists were akin to the French colonizers, waging war to conquer Palestine and to destroy centuries-old conviviality between Arabs and Jews. The advertisement was deliberately written to make Jews like him, who had fought against the Nazis, see the war in Palestine as a sequel to World War II, the next place where Jews were under genocidal attack. My father had a return ticket, but toward the end of his year in Palestine, he met the woman who became my mother and decided to stay. If he had If he hadn't met my mother, he probably would have continued as planned to Canada. As he told me once, I would not return to Oran at any price. He did not even mention France as an option. In your 1956 resignation letter from your position as a chief of staff at the Breda Jointsville Psychiatric Hospital, you wrote, I owe it to myself to affirm that the Arab, permanently an alien in his own country, lives in a state of absolute depersonalization. Unquote. It is not clear to me how much you understood that this Arab that you were talking about was not necessarily Muslim, but could be Jewish too. In your hospital, Algerian Jews were confined to the same pavilion together with Europeans, many of whom never ceased to suspect, harass, and despise them for enjoying their imposed status as Europeans. There are some similarities between Algerian Jews and the conversos, the Jews turned new Christians during the Inquisition in Catholic Spain, who were ostracized from their community, converted, and persecuted by Christians who refused to recognize them, a process that terminated the conversos' definitive expulsion from the Iberian Peninsula at the end of the 15th century. Algerian Jews were uprooted from their Jewish Muslim world, forced to be French citizens, and subjected to suspicion and hostility by the French settlers who didn't want them as peers. The French preferred to pretend that the Vichy regime was an accident, not truly French. The colonized Jews of Algeria knew better. A single story, Jewish school children sent out from their schools at the beginning of the Vichy regime in 1940, recurs in Algerian Jews' written memories. Why this out of all the harm suffered during the French colonization of Algeria? It is because they feared speaking about internment, colonization, confiscation, forced conversion. To testify to such things would go against the French Republican self-image, and the French were incapable of admitting that they had caused such harm. The only thing the Jews could say was that they were citizens who had been denied a Republican education. They could only voice grievances that would, at the same time, prove that they had not forgotten their republicanism and were deserving of citizenship. Am I wrong to imagine you laughing? Once French citizens, Algerian Jews who were already subject to different forms of de facto and de jure segregation within Algeria started to also face harassment around elections. Despite being classified as European, memories of their de facto European abusers stayed with Algerian Jews. Similarly to the conversos, stories of their abuse were passed down to their descendants out of conscious and subconscious efforts to remember the true nature of the French whom they were now forced to resemble. Upon his return to Algeria after World War II, my father learned about the deportation of his aunt and uncle and their 3 children from Paris to Auschwitz. When he went to Paris after the war, he learned that, quote, it was the French themselves that informed the Germans that Jews lived in a certain building or a street, unquote. Perhaps this news is what shortened his stay there, and you see, the story has been passed down to me, and I cannot forget it. Some Algerian Jews enjoyed the colonial taxonomy that classified them within the Blida Joinville Hospital as members of the settler race. For others, however, it meant reliving painful experiences and traumas. For in the wing for Europeans, they were confined with those who were responsible for their disorders. But there was no language available for them to describe their symptoms. The only psychiatric analysis of the mental state of Algerian Jews was conducted by Victor Trenga, another racist Frenchman like Meunieri, who earned his doctorate with a thesis he wrote in 1902 on the psychosis of Algerian Jews. That they were technically made French 30 years before Trenga wrote his thesis, and thus according to the French state there was no such thing as an Algerian Jew, didn't prevent him from using his racist pen to pathologize their difference, insulting them on page after page. Our ancestors may have had psychoses, but not of the kind described by Trenga. Colonial disorders, as you taught me, are never just individual pathologies. If you had not died so young, maybe you could have revised your text about colonial disorders to include the Algerian Jews. Maybe you could have analyzed the long-lasting effects of the amputation of Jews from Muslims, and this amputation's role in both groups' shared colonial disorder. I think about my father's return from the hell of the French internment and forced labor camp, and later his service in Europe as part of 2nd Armored Division, 22nd Colonial Group of FTA during World War II, when he was segregated from his French battalion members, de jure and de facto. Upon his return, he discovered that his French citizenship had finally been re-established almost 1 year after the landing of US and British troops in Algeria, but everything else was the same. And as much as he wanted to be French, he was not. He had nowhere to express what the French had done to him and to his family, since he was again officially French and again at the mercy of those who abused him. You were not yet in Algeria. How could you have known? In case 4 of the first series of cases in The Wretched of the Earth, you describe how a European policeman in a depressed state meets while under hospital treatment one of his victims, an Algerian patriot who is suffering from stupor, unquote. The policeman cannot sleep at night since he hears the piercing screams of those he and his peers had tortured during the day. Quote, now I've come so as I hear their screams even when I'm at home, especially on the screams of the ones who died at the police headquarters. One day you found him devastated after he stumbled upon one of your other patients who had been questioned in the police barracks. When you understood that the policeman had taken an active part inflicting torture on the patient, you hurried to where the patriot was being cared for. The personnel had noticed nothing, but the Algerian patriot had disappeared. After a while, you discovered the Algerian patriot in a toilet where he was trying to commit suicide. This is how you wrap up the case of the patriot. The personnel spent a long time convincing him that the whole thing was an illusion, that policemen were not allowed inside the hospital, that he was very tired, that he was there to be looked after, etc. Unquote. You saved him from committing suicide, but you prevented him from confirming the truth, that his anxiety was well founded, that this policeman who had tortured him was here, in your hospital. Was it you who didn't tell the staff about your policeman patient's involvement in the patriot's torture? Was it the staff's decision to shield the patriot from the reality that under colonialism, even the hospital is not safe? Or did you not find the courage to tell the staff that they had done wrong? It seems, though, that you wanted your readers to know that even in the space of the clinic, reality as it was experienced by Algerians could not be confirmed. I'm having difficulty finding the right words to say so, but I think that this is the role that citizenship plays in relation to the Jews, an illusory trick. Whenever they try to protest, they were and still are told, but you are citizens. And so the reality of the Jews' colonial pain was denied, and even when they had to leave all of their ancestors in their cemeteries, fleeing Algeria like thieves in the night with barely any belongings, they were told, but you are citizens, and it was your wish to become so. You see, dear Frantz, my ancestors in Algeria were not Europeans, but at different moments and for different interests they were counted as Europeans. I suppose you could not have understood this properly, since your informants were Jean-Paul Sartre and then the 2 Jews whom you befriended and worked with in Blida, none of whom revolted against their European categorization. You forgot, as they did, that they were colonized. They were acting in the role of interpreter, the tiny educated elite selected by the colonial state as informants. Interpreters are products of colonial aphasia and suffer from it too, for in the civil context the role comes with a certain status that makes those performing this role forget that they too are colonized. Your 2 colleagues in Blida, Jacques Azoulay, who has no family relation in me that I know of, and Alice Cherki, didn't forget about French colonialism. This was the basis for your collaboration. But they did forget, in order to live as new Christians, i.e. French citizens, that they, like their ancestors, were colonized not just when the French arrived in Algeria in 1830, but also through their citizenship status. And they especially forgot that they could still resist. Cherki writes about the Jews in the third person, as if she were a UN observant. Quote, rightly or wrongly, they, Algerian Jews, were classified as European by virtue of their political status, unquote. Azoulay seems even more inclined than Cherki to deny that his Frenchness is the symptom of his ancestors' colonization. Malgré eux, Azoulay and Cherki's role in the colonial schema was that of the interpreter. You, who arrived as a foreigner, spoke only in the language of the colonizers. You wished to avoid having French settlers on your team and, at the same time, sought colleagues who, having trained in the French psychiatric system, could understand your desire to transform its premises. Your Jewish acquaintances, who were also natives to this place, and especially those who had anti colonial political ideas similar to yours, were a perfect fit. Had it never occurred to you that you were all colonized by the French, or that they too were deserving of decolonization, or that they too were deprived of the words to acknowledge their situation? Did it ever cross your mind that the tacit covenant that bound you together was the bond of three colonized subjects who could not acknowledge themselves as colonized? If you could only have talked about it, all this could have come to light and guided you on how to speak to the rock of colonial power with words that would make the second hit of Moses' staff unnecessary. Like Moses, it seems that you had to die before reaching the promised land of decolonization. Cherki and Azoualy too were barred from entering it. I don't know whether Moses was barred from the promised land because he was punished for his blunder, or if he was saved from entering so as to be saved from seeing what awaited him there. I do want to speculate, given the fate of Algeria after decolonization, you were saved from seeing how Algeria embraced the double myth of the one, Arab and Muslim. Allow me to further speculate. If you, Azoualy, Cherki, and others could have entered or actually stayed in Algeria, the myth of the one would have become impossible. That Jews could not eat figs and pomegranates with Muslims, I venture to say, was the first sign that the promise of the promised land was broken. The expulsion of Algerian Jews encroaches upon all Algerians' being. You were spared the image of the forced departure of the Jews in 1962, mortified, chastened, and crushed. I truly cannot understand how you could ignore the fact that Algerian Jews were also colonized and that citizenship was imposed on them precisely to prepare them to act as interpreters. Your disavowal is even more troubling given the long discussion of the Jews in your otherwise incredible black skin white mask, where the Jews become a unified category. This abstraction elides the histories of diverse Jews whose individual communities were destroyed in order to make up the collectivity Jews to which you refer. It seems that you inherited this category from Sartre, for whom Algerian Jews don't seem to exist. Your later encounters with Algerian Jews didn't seem to impact this heritage, and yet I know you knew we existed. Cherki mentions the role she and Azoualy played in introducing you to the Algerian Jewish community. Quote, Jacques Azoulay and I, as well as others, helped introduce Fanon to the Algerian Jewish community. While in France, he had on more than one occasion claimed that as a minority he identified with the Jewish condition, but he knew very little about the history and local culture of Algerian Jews, unquote. But why could you see us only as a condition? Relating to the Jewish condition instead of real Algerian Jews means naturalizing a certain abstraction produced by the taxonomizing logic of French colonialism, the conversion of a diversity of Jews into a single people living under a single condition. Though Cherki doesn't explain why she puts this idiom, the Jewish condition, in quotation marks, I read it as indicative of the uneasiness that an Algerian Jew like herself might feel about this generalization. Under a generalized Jewish condition, differences in skin color, clothing, languages, prayers, habits, crafts, music, narratives, medicine, and hygiene could all be organized along a hierarchical ladder oriented in favor of French embourgeoisement. It should be said explicitly that not only were Algerian Jews not Europeans, they were not European Jews either, but Arab Jews, Muslim Jews, or Berber Jews like Cherki herself. Cherki distinguishes herself from Azoualy, who speaks about Algerians as Arabs while excluding himself from this identity, as if Algerian Jews were not Arabs too. Being an Arab Algerian for Azoualy meant being Muslim. Indeed, it was with you, Cherki writes, that Azoualy discovered that there was such a thing as a Muslim cultural identity, and that it was important, that there was a link between cultural oppression and aspects of psychopathology, unquote. Cherki knows very well that our elders were part of Algerian culture. For them, she writes, French was the language of politics and commerce, while Arabic and Hebrew, often conflated into the local Judeo-Arabic dialect, were the languages they used to speak about emotions, books, spirituality, and moral values, unquote. She is also aware that colonialism made the young expect their living elders to hide their Arabness when in their company. Thus, for example, those elders who opted to dress in European clothing only when they had to go to administrative services would also wear such clothing to the wedding of a modern grandchild. In an interview with Cherki, Azoulay tells her what he learned from you. Quote, Fanon's intellectual approach enabled me to apprehend a content that I would otherwise consider folkloric, unquote. Do you hear what I hear? Do you realize how much Azoulay had made the colonial gaze his own? Only when you both roamed the country, Numa Murad describes your field trips. Fanon drags Azoulay behind him in the villages, in search of the social life of the Algerians and the way in which they deal with madness, that Azoulay truly saw the culture and habits of Arab society. Yet, of course, if he were as foreign to it as he implies, he would have asked someone else to accompany you in your explorations. You chose him because he could show you around the land of his ancestors. He learned from you to recognize the particularities of Arab society as culture, but he did not recognize it as his culture. Nor did he see your field trips as an opportunity to reclaim what colonization had made seem foreign to him. I see symptoms of the colonial syndrome in Azoulay's reference to his grandparents' Arab culture as folklore. And you? You had to believe that the Jews were not indigenous in order to ignore the extent to which Azoulay had interiorized the colonial gaze, which you were so attuned to in your Muslim patience. Our ancestors, this also includes Jacques Azoulay, were colonized in 1830 and racialized as Jews. This meant the Arab and Berber in them had to be exorcised, and that they had to be dissociated from their Jewish Muslim world, even as they remained physically part of it. When my father was born, neither of these identities or senses of belonging, neither Algerian nor French, was obvious to him. Part of the North African syndrome's symptomology was the loss of the obvious. It was no longer possible to simply be part of society without having to prove one's authentic identity. It is no surprise, then, that my father sought to escape the hostile environment that Algeria had been made to be and was even willing to join French military units to fight the Nazis and their French collaborators. It is likely that my father would disagree with my diagnosis that he suffered from colonial disorder. He never spoke about himself in such terms. However, as his daughter, I recognize how his colonial disorder was transmitted to me, even though I was born outside of Algeria. I am the fruit of his third attempt at escaping colonial alienation when he moved to the Zionist settler colony. The signature of this transmissible disorder is a state-sponsored ignorance that cultivates denial of one's circumstances and a general disorientation. This makes it harder for its inheritors to understand the causes and origins of their malaise. It took me several decades to see that I am a product of what I consider today to be the mass kidnapping of babies from the Jewish Muslim world. Due to a transmissible colonial disorder, our parents surrendered us to the Zionist project that gave us a surrogate history to call our own. We recognize this surrogate history as ours from the moment we first opened our eyes. When I was able to gradually differentiate myself from this history, I realized how little I had left to reconnect myself to the world of my ancestors, to Algeria, North Africa, Africa, or Andalusia. Like you, dear Frantz, I refuse to accept this amputation of my history and myself that colonialism has wrought. Part of my refusal means recognizing other types of kinships of anti-colonial care, the kind that this epistolary journey rehearses and renews. Isn't this the sort of kinship that guided you when you chose to join Algerians in their struggle and to identify yourself as an Algerian? My choice to recognize myself in my ancestors' identities is part of practicing this kinship of care, care for the world that we are being told no longer exists and will never exist again. I connect this care with a commitment to inhabit my ancestors' world and refuse to accept that it is past. The story of one of your patients, case 2 in your second series of cases, conveys how disorienting colonialism's forced mass conversion was. Once the Algerian Revolution started, even though your patient was not interested in politics, he was caught. He had to be either an Algerian militant or a traitor. He was haunted by this colonial either-or approach to identity, and because he had not joined the FLN, he started to believe that everyone, including his parents, saw him as a traitor. Desperate, he moved to the European neighborhood, as if to confirm that this was who he actually was, a traitor. His physical appearance, you write in his case description, seemed then to safeguard him against being stopped and questioned by the police patrols. In parentheses, you explain, he looked like a European. Other Algerians who walked in the same neighborhood were arrested, maltreated, insulted, and searched. His drama was the opposite. He was Algerian but went unnoticed. As you write, this uncalled for consideration toward him on the part of the enemy patrols confirmed his delusion that everybody knew he was with the French. Even the soldiers had their orders, they left him alone. Unquote. Only when he acted as an Algerian, that is, when he tried to challenge the presence of armed French soldiers in his city and to steal their machine guns, was he treated as one. He was arrested and tortured. After a few days of torture, the truth was revealed. He was neither an FLN militant nor the embodiment of the new Algeria. Rather, he suffered from a colonial disorder. As you remark, during the year 1955, cases of this type were very numerous in Algeria. Reading the different cases, we can easily understand that the disorder experienced by your male patients was a colonial pathology. However, there's the glaring absence of women in your case studies. While several rapes are accounted for in the cases, it is clear that these are but a fraction given the pervasive deployment of rape by French soldiers against Algerian women. Who helped these women during the colonial war, before it and when it was over? Were they supposed to celebrate their Algerian citizenship when the war was over? Were they supposed to forget about these rapes so that every once in a while the rapes could be rediscovered in the French press amid a fresh burst of outrage? I am gratified that though you didn't treat the women who were raped, you included and acknowledged accounts of rape in the cases you discuss. I have a question that I haven't found addressed in the literature on rape, and I want to share it with you. It is related to a broader democratic aphasia that still impedes us from recognizing that everywhere democratic regimes are built upon mass rape. We know that colonial rape in Algeria didn't start with the war's onset. Algerian women were raped in the first decades of colonization. That Jews were among the victims of this colonial violence, including rape, never became an object of study. Is this because, as presumed French citizens, their rapes were not seen as part of the larger colonial violence perpetrated by the French? Hosni Kitouni, an Algerian historian whose research focuses on the first decades of colonization, confirmed my intuition, noting that there is very little information about Algeria's Jews between 1830 and 1870, except some scattered references that single them out and stigmatize them. In reply to one of my questions, he wrote, "While the counting of the population effectively distinguishes its different components, Arabs, Kabyles, Jews, Kulugli, this distinction disappears in the accounts of the conquest war. However, the Jews lived among the populations targeted by the repression. Thus, for example, rarely are the Jews mentioned among the prisoners or among the despoiled, etc." Unquote. Do you remember the story of B? He was an FLN militant who came to you because he suffered from insomnia and persistent headaches. One day he learned, through a message he received from his wife, that she had been raped and beaten by French soldiers. You shared his story, quote, "For several months he had heard many stories of Algerian women who had been raped or tortured, and he had occasion to see the husbands of these violated women." Unquote. Not only did he feel that his wife had tasted the French, but he also had, quote, "an irresistible impulse to tear up a photo of his little girl. That girl," he told you, "has something rotten about her." He also told you, "While I was looking at the photo of my daughter, I used to think that she too was dishonored." In a few sessions, he stopped seeing the sexual violence used by the French against his wife, and maybe against his daughter too, as capable of splitting his family's life into two irreconcilable phases, the before and after, the pure and the rotten. From thinking, "Oh well, there's not much harm done, she wasn't killed, she can start her life over again," but obviously not with him, B came to realize that they'd raped her because they were looking for me. He expands. It was to punish her for keeping silence that she'd been violated. She could have very well told them at least the name of one of the chaps in the movement, and from that they could have searched out the whole network, destroyed it, and maybe even arrested me. That wasn't a simple rape. It was the rape of an obstinate woman who was ready to put up with everything rather than sell her husband. And the husband in question, it was me." Unquote. The manifestation of B's colonial disorder is his initial identification of the colonized with the colonizer's deeds, of his wife and daughter with what the French soldiers did to them. His cure was in recognizing his wife not as disposable but as his political ally against the French. He saw her as one who didn't force him to be indebted to her, but rather freed him from their alliance. She didn't say to me, "Look at all I've had to bear for you." On the contrary, she said, "Forget about me, begin your life over again, for I have been dishonored." B decided to take my wife back after the war, for now they could cure their respective wounds together as he'd seen other Algerians do. Quote, "I've seen peasants drying the tears of their wives after having seen them raped under their very eyes. I've seen civilians willingly proposing marriage to a girl who was violated by the French soldiers and was with child by them." Unquote. There's something else I want to bring up. In 1962, 1 year after your death, your revolutionary proclamation, "The old Algeria is dead," materialized with the formation of a newly constituted Algerian state. However, most of the state institutions were not new, but were inherited from the colonial state. New man, new people, new nation, all are dangerous projects, especially when pursued by self-nominated leaders who feel authorized to pursue the new against the desires of others. If only your sensitive care for your patients could have tempered this deluded investment in the idea of the new man, Algerians might have translated your therapeutic practice into a political theory of decolonization. And we Algerian Jews, Muslim Jews, would not have become invisible over. In 1962, all Algerians deserved healing of all sorts from the hell of colonization, not just from the war for independence. One of the first actions of the Algerian state was to displace populations in order to make way for the new. The Jews were not expelled with force, but they were made to depart, for it was made clear to them that they could not safely stay in Algeria. Unlike the dhimmi contract that was essential to traditions of Islamic law and protected non-Muslim populations, the Jews were not even mentioned in the Evian Accords, out of which the independent Algerian state was born. Well, there wasn't much harm done. They weren't killed. They could start their lives over again elsewhere. The new Algerian state saw Algeria's indigenous Jewish population leaving and joined with the French in France, and it didn't object to the depiction of the displaced Algerian Jews as pieds noirs. Quelle honte, quelle tragédie innovée. Dear Frantz, imagine decolonized Algeria refusing to sacrifice its Jews for the Euro-Zionist Molech, setting an example for other Muslim countries who failed to stand against the pressure and actively expelled their Jews or encouraged their collective departure. Imagine the dying colonialism of the Euro-Zionist project. Wherever they landed outside of Algeria, however, our ancestors were recognized as Algerians, not as French or Europeans. In France, Canada, or Israel, differences between old and new Algerians were undetectable. They were all equally Algerians, Arabs, and those who tried to deny their Algerian identities and identify as French were seen as wannabe Frenchmen, pitiful. Writing about this brings tears to my eyes. I didn't always feel this sadness. It took years for this wound, which my father either ignored or buried, to be reopened in me. Sometimes I just want to send postcards with this notification. French citizenship was forced upon our ancestors. It didn't end our colonization. Can you recall, cher France, during your service as Chief of Staff at Blida Joinville, a single moment of apprehension in which you understood that the European patient facing you was actually a Jew? Neither a European nor a European Jew, but an Algerian Jew. I wonder if such a moment could have altered your admiration for self-fashioning, your desire to bury the old humanity and birth a new humanity and a new man. Could we, dear France, see eye to eye? Can we agree that it is an abduction when foreign citizenship is bestowed on some to sever them from other members of their people? Could we see, dear France, how the abduction facilitates the transfer of babies from one world to another? Sometimes I imagine myself as a gleaner, gleaning at the edges of a vast field, searching for the signs of my ancestors' refusal to be converted, proofs of this secular inquisition. A poem of my academic exhaustion. In your essay, Algeria's European Minority, you dedicate a few pages to the Jews. You already know what I think about putting my ancestors in this category, so I won't repeat it. I return to these few pages, since there is enough in the margins for me, bereft of ancestral resources, to glean. My ears, not unlike your pen, are guided by those verses from Leviticus on how to care for those who do not have. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. You didn't edit out the data you gathered about them, even when you were unsure what it meant. You left these numbers, records, details for the poor and the foreigners residing among you. Being foreigner to my people, I am grateful. I wrote this short poem for you so that you could hear my academic exhaustion. I'm not a psychiatrist, but I also see symptoms of the colonial disorder from which you suffered, especially when you complied with the command to see us as Europeans. I bet that if an Algerian Jew had told you, I'm not a European, you would not have insisted that she was one. Instead, it would have led you to reconsider your stance. Well, here I am. I bet that if we could talk, I wouldn't have to say much for you to recognize me as an Algerian, and for you to understand how the French citizenship conferred upon my Algerian ancestors was a forced conversion. I'm so eager to know if what I'm writing to you resonates. Were you worried that questioning whether Jews were Europeans would tag you as an anti Semite? Is this what led you to leave the Jews outside of your short history of plunder and imperial enrichment in the wretched of the earth? Quote, the well being and the progress of Europe have been built up with the sweat and dead bodies of N-word Arabs, Indians, and the yellow races. Unquote. Europe's enrichment from Jewish sweat didn't start with the Nazis. It dates back at least to the Jews' expulsion from Spain and Portugal. It is not that I think that the Jews should be included in every discussion about European colonial history, but there are some discussions in which their absence is troubling. Your and Jacques Azoulay's reluctance to acknowledge that you too were colonized and suffered from symptoms of the colonial disorder you diagnosed in your patients was a methodological error. After all, we know from your work that as long as colonialism is in place, no colonized individual can be out of this disorder's reach. This is probably what makes this non-psychiatric epistolary engagement with you feel so urgent to me. In your writing, you defied the white colonizers' characterization of black people as uncivilized, writing, I belong to a race that had already been working silver and gold 2,000 years ago. I belong to a race that, for centuries, was dispersed and resisted assimilation into a single historical subject, the Jews. I belong to a race that, for centuries, resisted incorporation into an expansive body politic that could command its members to become warriors or rulers with the power to command others. I am not echoing you, I say you speak for me too. It was the Jews who were the majority of jewelers in the Muslim world, who developed various techniques of goldsmithing and implanted their style in magnificent jewelry and other objects for ritual and daily ceremony. Since I learned about my descendants from the Jewish jewelers of the Ummah, I've immersed myself in my ancestors' jewelry making and practices of adornment. I look at those gorgeous beads and pieces of metal, and I trace, copy, pierce, fold, saw, carve, chisel, hammer, thread, and string. I'm not a professional jeweler. I simply concentrate on these objects and imagine, rehearse, and incorporate the gestures that I would have had as my birthright had I grown up among my ancestors. I simply could not restrict this discovery about our ancestors to textual knowledge. Embodying it meant appealing to my muscle memory. My father's dexterous hands appeared to me every once in a while as a bridge I didn't know existed between these once unfamiliar gestures and me. I cannot deny the therapeutic features of this activity, which I think explains my father's investment in working with his hands all his life. He could not stay idle. However, if he were in your clinic and if you had invested him to work with all alpha raffia as you asked the Muslim men in your medical ward to do, he would have refused, just as they did. The memory of being forced to pick alpha in the Bedou camp for the French to produce paper out of it was not easily expungible. This would not have been because baskets and mats are produced by women, but because convening indigenous people in a French facility and requiring them to make crafts with no clear purpose would have been too eerily familiar to what he and other patients recognized had been going on for decades in French establishments where Algerian labor and knowledge were extracted. One well-known example of this was the embroidery schools for girls. where the handcrafted products the indigenous girls were making were sold in the market. In these schools, very young girls were commanded to hold a pencil in their hands and spent hours tracing, as one report from 1907 put it, parallel lines and squares and diagonals inside these squares, and broken lines that modify these rectangles and diagonals, and so on and so forth, up to complicated designs that are found in the main models of carpets and are more or less common to them. When I started to understand the constellation of craft making in Algeria, I recognized how craft division intersected with other group divisions. From there, I was able to understand that I am a Muslim Jew, belonging to the jewelers of the Ummah, and not to a nation of warriors, the Zionists, that tore me away from my family's country and gods, with, as your predecessor Aimé Césaire put it, a savagery unparalleled in history. I belong to a race that, for centuries, lived in small-scale autonomous communal formations, undertaking different mutual aid initiatives and projects of care. Though mainly Muslims ruled this world, the Jews were organized as a semi-autonomous corporate community functioning on the basis of religious law, a community that was also shaped through its interaction with the Muslim court system. They were part and parcel of this world, and their care for it was expressed through the different crafts they mastered and taught to their descendants: tailoring, shoemaking, butchery, lamp making, scrivening, gold thread drawing, and jewelry making. Their work with precious metals was one of several skills that allowed them to simultaneously be part of and apart from their fellow world members. This is what made of them jewelers of the Ummah. Being a jeweler of the Ummah meant that one was a carrier of the memory of shared traditions and had the ability to retouch, to repair. This was one's mode of being in the world. These principles were expressed not only in the objects jewelers made, but also in the guilds and other more casual formations of which they were members. They cared for the world's well-being. These material activities rooted them in a cyclical temporality of renewal and shielded them from the destructive temporality of progress, which the conferral of French citizenship corroded. What you learned about Muslim society when you and Azoualy toured the country inquiring the forms of sociability in traditional Muslim society was also what characterized traditional Jewish society in the exact same place. In this society of shared tradition, you and Azoualy observed that religion was, in effect, apart from philosophical belief, a rule of life that strictly regulates the individual and the group. You even say, in Muslim countries, but you think only about Muslim peoples when you say, religion impregnates social life and gives no consideration to secularity, rights, morality, science, philosophy, all mingle with it, unquote. But Muslim countries hold non-Muslim peoples too. As you write in your short account of Algeria's Jews, 3/4 of all Algerian Jews still lived under traditional societal formations and had only a poor knowledge of French, considering themselves by tradition and sometimes by dress as authentic natives. Unquote. The remaining 1/4 of Jews consisted mainly of civil servants and tradespeople, forming a certain bourgeoisie, void of distinction, as Sophie Bessie describes the correspondent group in Tunisia. This group embraced conversion as willed assimilation, and their desires were often assumed to be representative of what the Jews wanted or wanted to be. Yet even among this group, it would be wrong to assume that all were willing to convert, or to assume that all believed that the colonial condition of their conversion disappeared because they were recognized as citizens. Providing their children with better chances for education, better professional opportunities, and a better quality of life played an important role in enticing the Jews to convert for the world they knew was largely unsafe for them. Attending to the innuendo of colonial relations matters, since it enables us to unlearn the imperial categories reproduced in our accounts. And so, dear Frantz, I want to talk to you about how you wrote about Algeria's Jews. Since you didn't conceive of the Jews as part of the colonized, you also accepted as an ontological fact their separateness. Early in your essay, Algeria's European Minority, you write, "A first group of Jews has bound its fate very closely with that of the colonial domination." Unquote. I wonder on what basis you dissociated them from an equally tiny Muslim elite, which also bound its fate very closely with that of colonial domination. After all, The creation and identification of a class of indigenous interpreters and colonial servicemen didn't start in 1870 when the Jews were turned into French citizens, but at the beginning of colonization in 1830. Innuendo is immensely important here because to identify it and challenge it to restore the existence of a Jewish Muslim world whose existence is erased in retrospect. Though destroyed, this world should not be depicted as already and forever gone. So much of the historiography on Algeria is marked by a conflation between what the colonial regime aimed to achieve and what still exists. The term Arki is used to designate Muslims who were recruited as auxiliaries of the French army during the Algerian War. This common way of defining those colonized, forced to collaborate subjects was determined by three imperial dividing lines: time, the Algerian War; space, the French military; and body politic, Muslims. But is Arki not the basic condition of all colonized subjects throughout history who in one way or another are forced to collaborate with the regime that rules them? Isn't it fundamental to the colonial condition that the colonized are forced to inhabit a world imposed by the colonizers, and only at certain moments and under particular circumstances can negotiate their situation, overtly and publicly resisting these colonial impositions? The anti-colonial challenge to colonial citizenship is first to find evidence that not all the members of a captive group like the Jews willingly embraced their conversion by decree. Second, it is to show that being Arki is a pervasive condition more than a matter of individual choice. Without imposing a general condition of Arki on all its subjects, settler colonialism could not sustain itself. I want you to look with me more closely at the first of the three imperial dividing lines, time. What colonialism aims to destroy are the principles and the formations that enable communities to care for the worlds over centuries. One such form of care, for example, was the attempt to reflect the cyclical temporalities of the world's different components and inhabitants. Cyclical time impedes colonial capitalism's expansion, premised on the imposition of temporality of progress, a major organizing principle of settler colonial life. This temporality is instrumental in turning colonial extraction into a fait accompli and socializing descendants of both colonizers and decolonized alike to look toward the future, as if the future were a real place ahead of them. Thus, regardless of the circumstances under which something comes into existence, for example, the Central Jewish Consistory of France, a patriarchal central administrative system established in Algeria in 1845 to regenerate Algerian Jewry, its status as an innate Jewish institution is already unquestionable, unabolishable. Progress works like a pipeline and doubts will stop the flow. Partition, differential citizenship, final solution. From the moment such decrees or resolutions are conceived, the work of colonialists is to find practical solutions for their implementation. Imperialism obliges. Anti-colonial aspirations to transform the future are different from the future-oriented claims of imperial projects. But the acceptance of colonial temporality involved in transforming the future collapses them together in unsettling ways. It requires potent and demiurgic actors, colonialists and collaborators, empowered to impose their inventiveness and creativity on others through ideas premised on imperialism, violent license to destroy, and disguised with pioneer ethos that the sky is the limit for development and extraction. Such visions, devised by statesmen, jurists, architects, archivists, or historians, necessarily infringe upon the visions of other unschooled in empires, institutions of progress. In the imperial human factories that produce people and provide them with history that is not theirs, futures are also manufactures to impose upon these people. For those who make this history, it is theirs. For the majority upon whom it is imposed, it is not theirs. Is the only way to escape the human factory by tasking the colonized to make history? Old Algeria is dead is a scary call that no one in pre-colonial Algeria would have dared proclaim. Obviously, the world made by the colonizers ought to be dismantled, but does the history of Algeria start with what the colonizers imposed? For what the colonizers did when they arrived in Algeria was proclaim that old Algeria is dead. I cannot ignore the colonial overtones when I read what you wrote about our ancestors. The men and women of Algeria today resemble neither those of 1930 nor those of 1954, nor yet those of 1957, We witness in Algeria man's reassertion of his capacity to progress. Unquote. People do not progress. That is a colonial myth. Our ancestors' failure to stop the colonizers' genocidal violence testifies more to the nature of that violence than to our ancestors' capacities. If you had known Algeria post-independence, I'm not sure you could have ignored what this war did to the Algerian people, how much of the violence exercised by Algerian patriots during the war when the target was justified, sedimented and shaped independent Algeria. Unlike common narratives of the war that identify the beginning of Algerian resistance with the creation of the FLN, our ancestors opposed and resisted from the very beginning, as much and for as long as they could in many different ways. The ongoing struggle to rematriate from French museums the skulls of 500 Algerians who, during the first decades of the colonization, opposed the French invasion, is a chilling proof, if any is needed, of the longevity and resilience of their struggle. Scholars usually argue about your position on violence, which I find to be brilliant for your insistence that violence is never an isolated event about which one can take a simple side. I'm troubled, however, that your thinking on violence does not seem to inform your definition of decolonization and how you associate it with the new, how you counterpose it to the old. In the wretched of the earth, this division seems unavoidable, even desirable. There's no doubt that French Algeria had to end, but to escape the imperial fashioning of a timeline bifurcated between the old and the new, decolonization should have been envisioned as a reparative process of disentanglement from imperial webs. Decolonization should have meant not the violence of claiming anew and agreeing with the colonizers that old Algeria is dead, but rather the painful yet blissful work of re-inhabiting pre-colonial fabrics and mending the tears where world's ideas communities had been severed. The apocalypse of the new seems to be fashioned by a revolutionary imagination inherited from the French Revolution, the idea that each revolution inaugurates a new era. The new humanity you refer to when you write that decolonization is the veritable creation of new men is the epitome of the colonial disorder, maybe even its origin. After all, it was shortly after the French Revolution that the new revolutionaries undertook their colonial wars to propagate their ideas about the new man and citizen. The settler, you write, makes history. He is the absolute beginning. But the settler in question is French, and even before becoming a settler, he made history, putting himself, i.e., man, as the absolute beginning. The revolutionary year zero. Is this what the colonized want, or want to be? Man? It's different when, in black skin, white mask, you express an individual desire to be a man among men. Here, the desire to be a man is a response to a racist society in which man was the dominant category by which people recognized themselves as deserving of dignity. This same category was used as an instrument of abuse through its refusal against members of racialized groups. And yet, the negative desire not to be racialized in all spheres of life cannot be the only meaning of decolonization, nor the centerpiece of its imaginary. However, this man became a rallying cry for you several years later in The Wretched of the Earth. Decolonization is the veritable creation of new men, you argue, and explain how it works. The thing which has been colonized becomes man during the same process by which it frees itself. Unquote. The colonized were neither thing nor animal and never fully interiorized the colonizer's perception of them. The native knows all this, you wrote, and laughs to himself every time he spots an allusion to the animal world in the other's words, for he knows that he is not an animal. Unquote. So how did the status of the colonized as a thing, a status assigned by the colonizers, survive as a viable point of departure for the project of decolonization? Why reach back only far enough to disprove the settlers by claiming that becoming man is the end point of decolonization? Don't we want to go farther back than this? In this same essay, you admit that the atmosphere of myth and magic frightens me, but you nonetheless recognize indigenous peoples' power to integrate the colonized, the traditions and the history of their tribes, and give us a different type of status, as it were an identification paper, one in which we could recognize ourselves among others. So, I ask you, don't we want to go back to our myth and magic? Miraculously, given the extent of the violence used against them, the colonized often succeeded in transmitting something of who they were, even of their magic and myth, onto their children, despite the way colonial violence had thingified them. I almost dismissed this in my father. His world in which he used to recognize himself and in which he was recognized was fatally injured, but it was not fully erased from his body. Africa, I have kept your memory, Africa, you are inside me, Jacques Roumain writes in the poem that you quote. Decolonization, as I understand it, means withdrawing our investment in the human factories that produce people fit for the future. It means that people are not models and that worlds cannot be fabricated in factories. Reading the proliferation of anti-Jewish sentiments in the Algerian press in the late 19th century is akin to watching a horror film, for indigenous Algerian Jews are trapped inside an identity that isn't theirs. Was this human experiment another form of colonial entertainment? Just a few decades before cinema was invented, the Jews were captives of a never-ending audition for a horror film, in which their reward citizenship was the pretext for their persecution. Watching our indigenous ancestors try their best to seem French citizens was the settlers' pastime, those settlers who also provided the soundtrack, Down with the Jews. Our ancestors were not asked but compelled to become citizens. On paper, this sounds as if they were invited to be men among men, citizens among citizens. But what was proclaimed with the paper, the Crémieux Decree, was materialized only on paper. The paper came from outside of Algeria and was for a long while rejected by the settlers who refused to comply with it. Their resistance came in the form of anti-Jewish slurs and hateful practices against their new co-citizens. Insults, looting, massacres, protests, denunciations in the free press, and attempts to incite the local Muslim population to see the Jews as invaders. Ferhat Abbas writes, the anti-Jewish unrest of 1896 mainly expressed the colonists' desires to free themselves from the metropolis. Indeed, the cries of death to the Jews disappeared as soon as Algeria obtained financial autonomy and the creation of Algerian assemblies. Unquote. When the colonizers were in power, they could pass measures that ameliorated the conditions of the colonized, presenting concessions as a kind of generous gift and obscuring how their gifts had been extracted from colonized resources in the first place. Rather than gifts, the concessions should have been understood as the beginning of a debt repayment to compensate for imperial violence. This colonial generosity is the basis of a major disorder that harmed our ancestors and was transmitted to us in the form of democratic aphasia. I take inspiration from Anne Stoller's discussion of colonial aphasia among French colonizers regarding their crimes, but I twist it to account for the colonized and reflect the particular status of Algerian Jews. Aphasia, writes Stoller, is a dismembering, a difficulty in speaking, a difficulty in generating a vocabulary that associates appropriate words and concepts to appropriate things. Unquote. In the case of the Jews too, it would be misleading to speak about amnesia and forgetting, since the Jews didn't forget what the French had done to them, but rather lived in a state of dissociation, unable to fully articulate or fully forget. How could it have been otherwise, given that French citizenship in Algeria is discussed as if it were not the colonizer's citizenship, but a universal citizenship? Thus, when bestowed on Algerian Jews in order to mark their status change from protected non-Muslims as dhimmi to modern citizens, it provoked in them a democratic aphasia. The status change was both an act of forced conversion and an improvement in their place within differential colonial rule. In 1870, they still remembered how in 1831 the French monarchy inaugurated the destruction of Jewish communities by suppressing the autonomy of the Jewish nation piece by piece. Each and every such small community across Algeria was weakened in order to recreate its members as examples of one conglomerate, the Jews. After 4 decades of disempowerment and synthetic grouping, the Jews were deemed ready for repackaging as a group fit for what the French considered their democratic institutions, most notably assemblies and the voting system, institutions that enabled the French to run their colonies according to law and order. The French, Abbas writes, did not fail to imprint on the whole of Algeria their conception and their domination. In this onto-epistemologically French Algeria, our ancestors were made precarious tenants. Only as precarious tenants could colonizers give them citizenship in their own country. Our ancestors were drained of their ontological resistance and became captives of their new citizenship status, fearing they might lose it or lose it again, as they were made dependent on it. They started to speak about the citizenship as they were taught to, as an object of their desires, and repeated the confusion between emancipation, assimilation and conversion, and liberation, anti-colonial or decolonial, to a point that they started to believe that it was they who wanted to become French citizens in their own country. When Muslim Jews said they were relieved by the improvements brought about by their conversion via citizenship, saying this in a tone of gratitude for what they had received from their colonizers, they demonstrated symptoms of their democratic aphasia. To put it simply, they lost, as Abbas asserts, what in 1943 their Muslim brothers were able to affirm: their right to live, their right to existence. To be in the world became entangled with embracing these expressions of democratic aphasia. They were socialized to think in their colonizers' terms, which took a cumulative toll on them and their ancestors and descendants. Losses, costs, wounds, scars, abuses, and harassments remained. Algeria's Jews continued to experience shame, forbidden desires, insults, or identity and family disorders. From one generation to the next, the aphasia was exacerbated rather than attenuated. Children had less and less access to their families' eroded heritage, and they inherited a sense of denial that the French, whom they were taught to admire, were their ancestors' perpetrators and responsible for the ruination of their culture. They were often unaware that they suffered at all. I recently read the military record of my paternal grandfather's service during World War I. I was full of joy when I found out that on November 23rd, 1913, he didn't show up when he was called for French military service. This was another sign I amassed in a growing collection of signs testifying that the conversion to Frenchness was a forced one rather than a welcome one. I am proud to be his granddaughter and to know that colonialism didn't fully disrupt ancestral transmission, even if transmission took longer than it should have. 4 months after he deserted, he was condemned to 4 months in prison. He had probably known he would be punished, but he likely preferred prison to being sent away from his family and community to kill others for the French. Another sign was my great-grandfather's false testimony. Only 1 month after my grandfather was born, 1893, his father recognized him. In order to do so, my great-grandfather had to trick the colonial bureaucracy by attesting that he was unmarried, célibataire. He was in fact married at that time to a different woman through a Jewish religious marriage. Withholding the truth from the state is part of the colonized silent resistance. I don't know if this was a lingering polygamy that the French outlawed when Jews became citizens, but I suspect it was a kind of anomaly that existed in the intersection between French and indigenous law, both Jewish and Muslim. It was common among Jews and Muslims not to share with the bureaucracy what could be used against them, as was the commitment to continue to maintain networks of support and mutual aid through the formation of extended families. I'm trying to track down even more episodes where my ancestors resisted the substitution of their Jewish-Muslim conviviality, deemed past, old, with imperial formations, new, progress, the future. I tell you all this, dear Frantz, because I want to persuade you to turn your focus from the future, from the new, which tethers decolonial thinking to the colonial project. Your investment in the future is stated in black skin, white masks. The structure of the present work is grounded in temporality. Every human problem cries out to be considered on the basis of time, the ideal being that the present always serves to build the future." Unquote. To counter colonization indexed by the future, decolonization requires our investment in rewinding, undoing, and unlearning the practices, structures, laws, institutions, and principles that made the imperial future seem inevitable and the conviviality of the past hard to imagine. We must look for the residue of what can still be recovered and reclaim, revive, and reactivate that world. We must return to what colonialism has deprived of us. I am worried that these different temporal approaches are the basis of your understanding of race in your discussion of Jews and black skin white masks, or the origin of the different options you say are available to blacks and Jews to become a man among men. You focus on the innate incapability of individuals to pass as such, while completely sidestepping the European project of assimilation through which the Jewishness of the Jews could go unnoticed. As you say of the Jew, he is not integrally what he is. He is a white man, and apart from some debatable features, he can pass undetected. Unquote. Passing unnoticed was the protocol of forced conversion. While passing as white subsequently became an interiorized desire among many Jews, the transmission of resistance also continued, though sometimes in problematic ways. This campaign, known as the Emancipation of the Jews, which began in the 18th century, commanded the Jews to pass unnoticed by presenting, speaking, dressing, loving, and even hating like secular Christians. In other words, French emancipation required Jewish self-erasure. They were not whites, but were assimilated into whiteness only partially, forever new whites. In Black Skin, White Mask, your discussion of race and Jewishness comes through your interpretation of Jean-Paul Sartre's anti-Semite and Jew. As you write, you agree with Sartre's claim that the Jew is one whom other men consider a Jew. That is the simple truth from which we must start. It is the anti-Semite who makes the Jew, unquote. Do you hear what I hear? Insofar as the anti-Semite creates the Jew, it seems that it is the anti-Semite who disrupts the ability of the Jew to pass unnoticed, to enjoy the possible redemption of no longer being a Jew. But is this what the Jew wants, or what the white Christian wants? Can we properly infer from the Jews of today or the Jews of the 1950s, when you and Sartre wrote these works, from Jews who were born in their conversion as a fait accompli, what the new Jew in the abstract wants? Unlike what Sartre implies, it was not the anti-Semite alone who made the Jew. Rather, it was those modern liberal European actors who engaged in emancipating different Jews, effectively destroying the small and distinct communities in which they lived and turning them, first in Europe and then outside of it, into members of a cohesive historical subject whose members could go either unnoticed or unnoticed at the will of imperial actors. There's a strong parallel between France and Catholic Spain, which forced Jews and Muslims to become new Christians and who persecuted them when they passed noticed or unnoticed, depending on the inquisitor. The imperial apparatus of conversion is fluctuant, with variable content and distinct expectations that are random and taxing. It forces people to act as individuals and, as such, to do things they would not do when acting as a member of a community. In early 20th century Oran, for example, where Jews could not usually pass unnoticed, the draft for World War I allows Jews and Muslims to pass unnoticed by joining the French in their colonial wars and killing others. Military service during this war was tied to a European land grab in Africa and the rivalry between European imperial powers. My grandfather's refusal to accept the bargain was omitted from family memory and from history books, which speak about enthusiastic Jews who chose to fight in the First Colonial War as Frenchmen. Was it my grandfather's adherence to an artisanal profession like butchering, which was still part of a Jewish Muslim world whose laws still prevailed, that empowered him to refuse? His actions say, "I am not French." Had your approach to the Jews not been shaped by Sartre and this European emancipatory project for us, such a unified conception of the Jews might have dissipated over the course of your multiple encounter with diverse North African Jews. You could have noticed what European emancipators did to Algeria's indigenous Jews. Did it occur to you that going unnoticed was not the aim of Algerian Jews? Or that what French colonialism actually deprived us of was not being a man among men, but rather being Jews among Muslims? We cannot discuss this desire to be a man among men without accounting for the imperial command to be a man among men. Inseparable from their efforts to deprive colonized and racialized people of regard as men among men, the same imperial actors also extended such a poisoned opportunity to the colonized. This power to determine how, when, and as whom racialized subjects could pass was the signature of racial colonialism. Since their emancipation, Jews had not ceased to be noticed and unnoticed as Jews, Arabs, French, European, bourgeois, miserable, people of capital, usurers, scammers, artisans. And not much could help there, and not much could help as their Jewishness became unconcealable under the Vichy regime, when the settlers invented and implemented anti-Jewish measures even before they were required of France by Nazi Germany. This conversion, the extension of such an opportunity to pass unnoticed and take advantage of the world the colonizers made for themselves, is a form of colonization, and it ought to be decolonized. This means the recovery of different modes of being Jews, modes that are not individual but collective, modes that do not involve inventing a new imperial nation state as Israel in Palestine. Not taking into consideration these two modes of North African Jewish racialization, the deprivation of a convivial collective world on the one hand, and the imposition of imperial citizenship as emancipation on the other, Your analysis of racism ignores part of the colonial infrastructure that shapes the mechanics of racism. Yes, certain Jews could pass as European, as white, more easily than others, but that didn't depend only on their physical traits, which were only partially reduced to skin color, as Jews too come in different colors. Following World War II, Europe's interest in the preservation of its colonies and attendant racial formations required Nazism and anti Semitism to be narrated as exceptions, and the de racialization of the Jews was given as proof of Europe's recovered innocence. Including Jews and supporting Zionists to have a state of their own became a way to continue to exclude racial others. Saying, look, we support the Jews was a way for European states to keep using Jews as interpreters, mediators, and mercenaries of their colonial projects. It also gave Jews a way to pass unnoticed, mainly as national subjects, Israelis. The price, in your compelling terms, was the loss of our ontological resistance as Jews. The price was also the continuation of the imperial logic that had expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492 and colonized Algeria in 1830. The price was continued alienation for the Jews and violence for the Muslims who had been our sisters and brothers. Upon reading your psychiatric writings about the two wards in the hospital in Blida Joinville, the Muslim ward and the European ward, I wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry. You write that what enabled you to understand the psychiatric colonial condition in Muslim patients was the demographic organization of the patients in the hospital, such that, quote, Muslims and Europeans were not mixed together, unquote. Based on your experiments, you understood that a certain cultural relativism was required with regard to the Muslims. However, both you and Azoualy, the black and the Arab Jew, or was he a Berber Jew, performed as if you could pass unnoticed within a Western we. Trying to understand the Muslim patient's lack of interest in theater, for example, you write, the theater as we understand it does not exist among Muslims. Who exactly is this we? Was not everyone in the hospital, including yourself, the staff, and patients, part of a much more complex reality than the colonial binary allowed? After you describe several failures to achieve the same result with the Muslims that you achieved with the women in the European ward, you describe a moving moment of success when a Muslim orchestra came to the hospital, played and sang for all the patients. The Muslim women in the hospital, who on other nights were mostly reserved and applauded in the European way, applauded differently upon hearing the Muslim orchestra, with short, acute, and repeated modulations. You concluded, thus they reacted to the configuration of the ensemble in line with its specific demands. Certainly, you achieved something here, but what was it? A Muslim orchestra does not make sense, except during the Vichy years when Jews were banned from playing and Muslims filled the void left by Jews beginning in fall 1940. Do you mean non-European, Arab, Berber, that Jews and Muslims play as part of the same orchestra, as was common in Algeria? Or were the players perhaps a mixture of Jewish and Muslim Berbers? That you didn't know is understandable. That Azoualy perpetuates his ignorance is troubling. Could this have been part of his own performance to pass as European? Perhaps it could also be an effect of the spatial and conceptual configuration of your clinic, which implied that everything could be only Muslim or European. The applause of the women was a moment of grace, a moment of taxonomic failure. Could it be that listening to the local orchestra playing Algerian music, the Muslim women felt so à l'aise that they applauded freely in their own way because among the Europeans in the audience of patients were also Berber and Arab Jewish women who applauded in a familiar way to the rhythm of the music? Perhaps such Berber and Arab Jewish women felt that they had finally been catered to with their music and therefore welcomed their Muslim sisters to join in applauding as they had been used to doing. If your role in the Algerian Revolution and its legacy were not that important, I may have felt less inclined to single out these oversights. But you understand, dear Frantz, that I cannot. I wish you had not had to be a man among men in these moments, but could have been yourself, a black man among Arab Jews, Arab Muslims, Berber Jews, Berber Muslims, European settlers, European refugees, and others. I often wonder why you didn't say anything about being a man among men while in Martinique. In Black Skin, White Mask, you speak about the black man's belated encounter with white men. As long as the black man remains on his home territory, he will not have to experience his being for others. Unquote. It reads as if Martinique had not been under colonial rule for centuries, as if racism existed in these individual encounters between black men and French men in the metropole and was not inscribed in the colonies. Those whom the colonizers were invested in keeping unnoticed, unremembered, foreigners to their own land, were first the indigenous people. What made it so difficult for you to say that you were colonized? Was it that you were also a French citizen? Was it democratic aphasia? Was it only among Algerians in Algeria, a place where colonization could not be disavowed or sublimated, that you were able to act as a colonized subject and participate in the anti colonial struggle? Is this also the basis of your denial of how the Jews were colonized? Your biographers count your 3 attempts to leave the hostile environment of Martinique under Vichy rule before you were able to join the French African army in Oran. This was when my father was making his first escape from Oran. As you and my father were both colonized and racialized subjects, the colonizers employed your bodies to fight their wars. They created an opportunity for you both to prove that you could become men among men. That you escaped the Vichy regime in Martinique is only half the story. The other half is that you responded to Charles de Gaulle's universal address, calling the children of empire to prove that France was not alone and that its colonized subjects were ready to fight for freedom whenever they were called. This was proof of your French republicanism. However, this call was open to only some of the colonized. De Gaulle at first didn't want Jews in his battalions. Too many anti-Semitic settlers still in office in Algeria, despite the official end of the Vichy regime, continued to send the Jews to labor in camps instead. My father didn't want to miss the opportunity to show that he was a man among men and volunteered anyway. Here is my father's story in his own words. Vichy laws arrived to us in Algeria, and the government had to take all the Jews and put them in concentration camps and send them to Germany. I arrived at the concentration camp, and there I encountered my brother-in-law, Albert, the husband of Lucienne, my father's older sister. He was there before me. His cousin, René, who was my friend, was also there. After a while, my brother-in-law and the others warned René and me that a French captain was going to come that week and asked for volunteers for the French Free Forces. Half of France was already occupied. He said that the captain would speak nicely to us. Please do not raise your hands, he begged us. Do not volunteer for the war. I talked with René and told him, you and me, we will raise our hands and show them that we are fighters. I was 16 and a half. The big day arrived. We were organized in a formation. At 7 a.m., the French captain arrived dressed in red pants, polished boots, and black jacket with garlands and tassels. He started to speak about the homeland, La Mère Patrie, France, and gave a half-an-hour speech, at the end of which he asked, who volunteers? There was quiet. 2,000, 3,000 men kept quiet. All of a sudden, 2 hands were raised. They were René's and mine. They took us, and Albert yelled at me. I told him, leave me alone. These were the same Jews with whom I could not stay in Iran. Unquote. I wish I had known when I transcribed this interview with my father what I know now. I could have asked him for clarification. How many times did the French captain visit before my father volunteered? Was it difficult for the Jews in the camp to plan and coordinate their silence and their refusal to volunteer? Why was my father so eager to depart? Did he still believe he could be recognized by the French as a Frenchman? Was he so sure of himself, or did he feel he was so special that he believed nothing like what had happened to other Jews could happen to him? Was he in such a denial that he failed to see that those recruiters were the same Frenchmen who had sent him to this concentration camp? Was the camp so hellish that he just wanted to escape at any price? To what extent was the Vichy regime a surprise? What was it exactly that my father could not stand in the camp on the one hand and among the Jews in Iran on the other? Was it the Jewish community that mirrored to him that he would never be a true Frenchman, that he would always be like them? Or was it the settlers' anti-Semitism which made him believe that only outside of Algeria could the promise of self-fashioning be fulfilled? For my father refusing to listen to his older brother-in-law Albert and making his own decision created a moment of freedom. Leave me alone. If there was a moment of freedom here for my father, it was implied in his words. Unlike them, I am. Ignorant of the price he was paying, he adopted the colonizer's gaze when he declared himself to be unlike those Jews in Iran. He continued to see France as capable of providing him with opportunities for self-fashioning that his community could not. The other Jews in the forced labor camp who did not raise their hands may have remembered what France did to them. After all, as Jacques Attali describes under Vichy, it was as if French Algeria was just waiting for the Nazi occupation for the metropole in order to finally do what had long been dreamt of, getting rid of the Jews while continuing to ignore the Muslims. The French actually volunteered to open concentration camps before the Germans did. This is not surprising, as French colonialism in Algeria preceded the rise of Nazism, and outside did the Nazis on occasion in racial violence, one emblematic example, asphyxiating the colonized, known as les infumades. Some of the older Jews may also have been flooded with their parents' memories of waves of organized attacks on the colonized, attacks that either didn't spare the Jews or targeted them directly. The rumors about the landing of American soldiers would have already reached the camp. Reading my father's words, I cannot help thinking how disorienting it must have been for a young Algerian like himself to make such a decision at the moment when it seemed his community was on the verge of being liberated from the concentration camp. But the colonial ruse of rewarding individuals for leaving their communities was powerful. The reason the other Jews did not raise their hands was because the French captain who arrived to recruit them sought to further intern them. His specific battalion was created to prevent them from becoming French soldiers and to perpetuate their forced labor in another way. And this is what happened to my father, a second period of forced labor. It was only a few months later that my father would be drafted into an ordinary military unit in the French Armée d'Afrique. When the captain arrived at the Bordeaux camp, the life-threatening predicament of the Jews had not changed, and, as the 2 or 3 thousand Jews who were there understood, there was no reason to trust Frenchmen. On the other hand, why would my father, young and able, not jump at the opportunity to depart from the hell of the camp? It was only in July 1943, when the camps were finally closed, that he joined a real military unit. Once out of the camp, he tried his luck with the Americans who were in the city and asked to join the forces, but it didn't work. This teaches me that after the second period of forced labor, he was no longer completely fooled by the French, and though he wanted to go fight against the Nazis, he preferred to do it under the command of American officers, not French ones. You see, dear Franz, even if my were still alive, the questions would remain, no matter his replies. Whatever his reasoning may have been in that moment, it ought to be reconsidered in light of the fact that his logic was skewed by his colonial disorder, by his North African syndrome. He, like the Algerian Muslim you describe in Series B, Case 2, believed everyone saw him as a traitor and was trapped in an accusatory delirium. He needed to prove that he was not a coward Jew, what was projected on him by the French or by other Algerians who were also plagued by this syndrome. In fact, you and my father both participated in the same campaign in Alsace, though you were not initially recognized for your contributions to the French victory, since the whitening of the Free French forces was required. Cherki describes this in your biography. It was required to show the Allies that French soldiers participated in the liberation of France. Unquote. That my father didn't listen to his brother-in-law Albert or the 2,000 other members of his community is one thing, but that you didn't listen to Aimé Césaire and your father is yet another. In a letter written to your parents toward the end of the war, you admit that it was a mistake to have joined. If I do not return from the war, if one day you learn of my death in the face of the enemy, console yourself, but never say it was for the right cause, because this false ideology, shield of idiot secularists and politicians, should no longer enlighten us. Unquote. Well, my father returned from the war more confused than you did, and he did not know how to ask the question, if this war was a war to liberate all peoples, why are we not liberated? Though my father felt he was not free in his country, the restoration of fucking French citizenship after the fall of Vichy spawned another wave of democratic aphasia, preventing him and other Algerian Jews from articulating their unfreedom. The restoration of citizenship measure included a restriction on converted French citizens from reclaiming their rights as colonized subjects. In other words, at the moment one became a citizen, the right to question colonial citizenship or to claim reparations was lost. In the absence of language to process his experience, and motivated by an impulse to find a way out of what he couldn't even name, his colonial disorder, my father left Algeria. Thereafter, he was ready to endanger his life in yet another war waged by Zionists against Palestinians, whose causes he didn't really understand. Luckily, in the Zionist colony, he was perceived as an Arab and only assigned to serve as a driver, so at least I know that he did not kill or expel any Palestinian. When we talked about his decision to volunteer for this war, he replied with a rhetorical question: "Why did I come here to Israel? I was free and I came as a volunteer. If I'll die, so I'll die." He sounds to me like a person who has lost all attachments. In 1943, upon his return from his voluntary service in the French Africa Army, Farhat Abbas drew a lesson from the French refusal to restore citizenship for the Jews in Algeria. In his Manifesto of the Algerian People, which I assume you know, he questioned what is known as his assimilationist position. Learning from the revocation of the Crémieux Decree, Abbas emphasized that assimilation through citizenship could not replace a liberation project. The time has passed when a Muslim Algerian will ask for something other than to be an Algerian Muslim. Unquote. Abbas explained that what Algerians had to accept earlier, for example citizenship under French Algeria as Muslim Algerians, had lapsed, and that now the horizon for liberation concerned those who were primarily Algerian citizens. With sadness, I say that this democratic aphasia had devastating consequences for the prospects for Jewish Algerians to ask to become Algerian Jews, and also deranged their capacity to recognize the obvious, that they were thrown out of their country by those who invaded it. I want to believe that you are horrified to learn from my letter that decolonization was achieved partially by sacrificing the Jews. Toward the end of the negotiations with the French during the Evian Accords prior to Algerian independence, the Algerians, only Muslims now, found themselves discussing what to do with the Jews, as if the Jews were an Algerian problem. Paradoxically, now I want us, the Jews, to become an Algerian problem. I want Algerians to be bothered by the fact that our unwilling departure risks becoming part of their DNA, if it hasn't already, considering that those born after 1962 do not even know that Jews are integral to Algeria. They risk normalizing the colonial perspective as theirs in their continued failure to recognize their indirect contribution to the Zionist movement's investment in separating us from Muslims. In my dreams, on the night of the next full moon, all the muezzins call on us to return, and their voice is heard by us, those who already walked away, to vocally state our anti-Zionism. In looking at any image taken in Algeria from the invention of photography up to 1962, I envy the simply being there-ness of the photographed people, standing, sitting, walking, breathing, eating, drinking, laboring, celebrating, with no explanation, no program of repair, but a multitude of daily acts of caring and mending. For a long time I refrained from comparing the expulsion of the Jews from Algeria and the expulsion of Palestinians from Palestine. The Zionist instrumentalization of such symmetry as the basis for rejecting Palestinians' demands makes it very difficult to find a way to articulate this. To a certain extent, however, such a comparison can be generative, for it forces one to ask how the expulsion of the Jews, facilitated by their conversion into Europeans and Euro-Zionists, became the exchange rate of decolonization. That is, how did it become acceptable for Jewish bodies to be trafficked between French Christians and Algerian Muslims? And how did this traffic imposed through international agreements of decolonization contribute to the possible non-solution, non-solutions offered to Palestinians, especially in a world where assimilation aligned all Jews with the Euro-American Christian world? I wonder if you ever thought about the tension between your assumption that the Jews were Europeans and the meaning of Algerian independence to which you subscribed. I wonder what the fate of Algerian Jews would have been if you, or someone like you, could have attended to their colonial syndrome and offered an analysis of their situations as members of the Algerian people. Dear Frantz, don't you think that the landscape of the colonial world might have been different? With gratitude for your anti colonial legacy, yours, Ariella Aïsha.